do a very just brief introduction. Oh, thank you for the hands. Great, thank you. So yes, I'll do a very just brief introduction. So as introduced, I'm Matt, and I'm a Detective Chief Inspector, currently based within the Mosaic team, and I'll kind of explain what that is a little bit later on in the presentation. I also support Chris Windsor with the DA portfolio, support the VORG portfolio as well, and then have recently stood up our standalone technology facilitated abuse thematic area within the force to kind of look at how technology is being used as a mechanism to exploit and abuse vulnerable people. So that's just kind of a very short background for me. The presentation today, it'll be a mix of kind of talking around things I know a lot of you on the call will be familiar with because of your backgrounds in the kind of adults safeguarding space, but hopefully we'll give a bit of a context of some of the things that we're thinking about with policing those crimes, and then also talking around some of the projects on the horizon for kind of what we're doing to change and address our response to domestic abuse. So just an overview of what we'll cover. It'll probably be around half an hour, 35 minutes. Depends if people have questions as we go. Please, if you do have questions as you go, put your hands up. The two people who've got their hands up, feel free to put them down now, otherwise I'll come to you for questions. But if you have any questions as the kind of the presentation progresses, then just put your hands up and I'll try and come to you rather than having to wait till the end. But there will be a kind of a Q&A at the last bit. So we'll start by kind of going through some of the Sateria principles that originally came through from the RASO world and how they intersect and weave into the context of domestic abuse. I'll talk a little bit about pathway distinction, which really came out of the Bright Light academic research. And again, a lot of this will be familiar to you all, but the differences in DA between kind of intimate partner violence, IPV, and then familial domestic abuse. Touch a little bit on sexual violence in the context of DA and some of the nuances within how we look and tackle that. A bit of non-fatal strangulation, which is mainly kind of talking around the prevalence, the risk identification factors within that crime type. Some of that adults at risk, vulnerable adults, and domestic abuse, and the difficulties and hidden aspects of that can often come across in investigations. A little bit about DHR learning from both a national and local perspective, and then I'll touch upon the job I'm in at the moment, the Mosaic program, and then what we're kind of doing as a investigative improvement work at the moment. So, importance of context, again, I'm sure it comes to no surprise to any of you on the call, the context in domestic abuse and how that is understood by officers, practitioners, safeguarding bodies, people that work with people with domestic abuse is vital. So the three pillars that are hopefully familiar to most of the people on the call came out of the work that kind of our Bluestone teams and Sateria did, and is now kind of nationally across policing in this victim-centered, suspect-focused, context-led, and then also certainly within the work of Mosaic, but I'll talk about again later, this extra pillar of anti-racist and making sure each of those pillars and themes run through how we respond to investigations. So what do I mean? So one, victim-centered, and investigations are centered around the needs of the victim. Certainly in RASO, that came through from our people telling us that they have been raped, or are people reporting it, i.e. do they want someone to know and access safeguarding support but don't support a police prosecution, or do they want a police prosecution and need all of the kind of criminal justice processes that run with that? So we should be centering our investigations to the victim and making sure we're doing sometimes risk dictates we have to go beyond what the victim initially says they would like us to do, but it's really centering the choices and decisions in the investigation based on the needs of the victim. When I see suspect focused, that's around shifting the narrative. So again, we started in the RASO world, but he's equally kind of relevant in the domestic abuse space. It's shifting the focus of investigations to the behaviour, the methodology, and the background of the suspect. So not focusing on how the victim has behaved or what their background is, but around how those the suspect has built those patterns of control, the choices they've made, the situations they've created within that relationship to keep that power dynamic. So it's really making sure those investigations are focused on the behaviours of the suspect, not on the behaviours of the victim. And then context-led is around every situation, every relationship connection, every crime type is nuanced. An assault, so a physical assault, an ABH, if someone is punched to the face, for example, is very different in context of a relationship. Is that two brothers who have gone out drinking after the Football World Cup and have ended up in a fight still categorised as a domestic abuse case based on the legislation? Or is it a punch to the face, but within a relationship that is ingrained in coercive control, and they've been together 30 years, and that person, is not allowed to leave the house, doesn't have control over their finances? The crime reported to us in both scenarios could be a punch to the face, an ABH, but the context behind that and the relationship, and again, I'll say it numerous times and people will be sick of me doing it by the end, but the control and the power dynamics are very different depending on the context of the situation. And then the anti-racist is that thread that needs to run through our investigations, making sure that the response, the language, the actions of policing and wider people connected in the criminal justice system are not biased or misinformed or done differently based on someone's ethnicity, perceived ethnicity, or their background. So those kind of pillars all created, in my kind of view, the context of the situation, and they need to be in the heart of our response towards any domestic abuse investigation. So in terms of intimate partner and familial distinction, so one of the things we learned when we had the Bright Light academics in, and hopefully most of you either know of that or have heard of it, was when we had the kind of academics come in who were involved in the opposite area work, come in and have a real look through our domestic abuse investigations, our processes, for us to understand kind of holistically what we were doing well, where were our elements for improvement, and how could we make the systems better. So one of the things that came out of their work was around this kind of pathway distinction, and they talked around three within their report. So intimate partner violence, or IPV, familial domestic abuse, and then also honour-based abuse. So they kind of tore out those three different lanes, channels, streams, pathways, whatever you want to call them. And so I thought it might be interesting. Again, this probably comes as no surprise to most of you on the call, but just to kind of dissect two of those in a little bit more detail. So you have the intimate partner violence, and I've broken these down into kind of a bit of a generic overview of the most common occurring relationship type, dynamic, types of use and prevalence, caveated with, of course, there are cross-cutting boundaries in all of these, but these are what you find most typically in if there can be a typical DA situation, of course, but the most typical variation of either intimate partner or familial. So for intimate partner, the relationship applies to that current or former spouses, cohabitating couples, dating partners, regardless of sexual orientation or whether they are physically cohabitating with each other. The typical core dynamic of those intimate partner violence situations are normally heavily rooted in patterns of power, coercion and control, and it frequently escalates in frequency, severity, and often culminating in that severe physical and emotional control, and in a lot of circumstances violence. The types of abuse, that can be physical violence, that can be sexual violence, emotional and psychological manipulation, stalking within relationships or post end of relationships, and financial and economic control. And the kind of prevalence, the typology, it's highly gendered. So women and girls are disproportionately experiencing severe injuries, the effects of stalking, sexual violence, most often from male partners. Obviously, female or male abuse occurs, same-sex partner relationship abuse occurs, but within intimate partner violence, the prevalence is skewed to be more highly gendered, where women are disproportionately the victims and survivors and targeted from the abuse. And again, so then looking at this, the kind of typical, for want of a better word, kind of all the most commonly occurring familial domestic abuse, this broadly covers the kind of abuse occurring within that family setting, and that can include parental to child, that can include child to parent, so plus 16, but over 16 children towards elder adults or grandparents, sibling violence, or abuse from kind of wider relatives. Dynamically wise, this often relates to kind of that misuse of power. So power is still part of it, but it's that misuse or balance of power either because of a dependency need or because of a generational imbalance, rather than it being a dynamic of romantic inequality. So that kind of intimate relationship power imbalance. And it can, of course, include physical, social, and emotional, the same as IPV, but it also takes on specific forms of familial abuse, so neglect, forced marriage, so-called honor-based crimes, or kind of adolescent to parental violence. And this involves normally more diverse perpetrators and victims, so this is less gendered than the IPV section, and that can have young male or female perpetrators abusing elder parents, or multiple perpetrators in the family targeting one particular person for a reason. And then you also, and I didn't put it on this slide just in case for time, but the academic is also then talked about honor-based abuse being that and a separate kind of distinction worthy of note, and all the different power dynamics and the risks that come within that wider so-called honor-based abuse and violence that takes place. I should ask, any questions so far? I know I've rattled off a lot of information, but any questions before I move to the next one? Oh, good. So sexual violence, and I could talk about this for, we could spend the whole time talking about this. So I focused on it more specifically in the context of IPV, so that intimate partner setting, rather than that wider familial abuse. And I've got a background obviously working within child protection and Bluestone, so I've seen kind of both of those sides. But in broad brushstrokes, so sexual violence in the context of domestic abuse, in the kind of intimate partner setting, relates to any non-consensual sexual activity, behaviour imposed by that intimate partner or obviously family member, and it needs to be understood as a critical tool for perpetrators, another tool in their toolkit of abuse, so to speak, to exert that power, control, intimidation, and that can range a wide set of actions from forced acts, threats of acts, psychological coercion. And in my digital space example, I was up at the Vogue conference recently, and I saw that there was some people using AI to generate videos of sexual assault, rape scenes with their intended victim, send them those videos as that element of control or coercion of this is what would happen to you if you don't comply to what I'm asking for. So the technology as well, which again could be a whole talk in itself, can be used and manipulated within all DA, but can also be used within that threat of sexual violence or coercion aspect. So just again, a lot of this will be known to you, so I appreciate all of your experiences, but just to reinforce from what we see and what we've learned from kind of Bluestone, Soteria, that so sexual abuse within relationships rarely occurs as an isolated incident, and it's comorbid, so it frequently co-occurs with physical, emotional, and financial abuse, and it's fundamentally around that power and taking away that person's ability to have free and informed consent. Because the perpetrator is often an intimate partner, especially in the IPV setting, but survivors have normally a history of consensual sexual activity. Not always, I know, but there is a high prevalence of a history of consensual sexual activity, and that can create confusion, kind of that cognitive psychological dissonance, and make it harder for the survivor to immediately recognize or label the experience as abuse or sexual violence, and that can be a very confusing time and impact their ability to report and support police investigations quite understandably. And perpetrators often use this sexual violence or the threats thereof to degrade, humiliate, and reinforce this kind of ownership and control. And again, I've said it a lot of times, but what we know from the research and certainly a lot of the academic stuff is that control, and that the perpetrator trying to keep and observe that control is often one of the most high risk and prevalent factors within DA relationships. Consent, again, as people know, is not a blanket agreement, but that can be barriers we have to break down with victim survivors. So it's not a blanket agreement just because there's a relationship in place. It must be free, informed and ongoing every time. And someone can withdraw that consent even within a marriage or long-term relationship. And especially when we get to the slide on kind of domestic abuse within the older generations, that knowledge around that pre-culture can sometimes be something that they're not aware of, or they've never been kind of learned or conditioned to understand. But finally on this one, the physical and psychological toll, of course, on victim survivors is profound, and it often, people who've experienced sexual abuse, sexual violence, often have those coinciding long-term mental health challenges, severe trauma, PTSD, depression, anxiety, high risk of self-harm, suicidal ideation. And I know from some of the people on the call around seeing Southwest Ambulance and other areas of business that kind of working with other services and everyone having a piece of the puzzle and seeing a different effect of that abuse is something that is really important for that information sharing, for us to get the whole context of how that is impacted on an individual. So non-fatal strangulation. So from a what is it lens in terms of what do we look at? So it's the obstruction of blood vessels or airway from external pressure to the neck, and obviously resulting in decreased oxygen. And it's when it does not cause death. I know it might sound obvious, but non-fatal. So it's where death has not occurred as a result of the strangulation. There's different methodologies. So most commonly known or recognised is kind of manual strangulation. So that's that hands around the neck. You've then got kind of chokeholds, headlocks. You've got strangulation via a ligature or an object. You've got hanging. You've also got smothering or positional asphyxia. So forcing people from that, like the old army poses, forcing people to stay in one position for a long period of time that can cause that inability or suppression of someone to be able to breathe properly. And again, these stats are slightly old, so apologies if people have some that are more kind of prevalent, but this is from kind of research back in 2020, 2021. So you've got 1 in 6 female homicide victims in the UK were killed by strangulation, and most commonly occurring in that DA setting. If there was prevalence of previous victimization through non-fatal strangulation, that essentially equated to an increase of 700% in their odds of becoming a future murder victim. And a man who strangles a woman once is 750% more likely to kill her, and that increases as the multiple of strangulation episodes increase. So again, this 700% increase effectively if the partner has strangled or they've been the victim of strangulation into them being a future victim of murder. And again, with all these things, there's a lot of crossover and comorbidity with offenders that utilize strangulation as a offending methodology, having a high risk background, previous domestic abuse history, and can be linked to RASO, serial sexual offending. It's not saying every person who's ever strangled someone will have a history of that on the systems, but there is a high prevalence of kind of that being comorbid and co-running. And professionals, and that's police and support and other agencies, should not expect a victim to describe this near-death experience as it often is or feels like, calmly or chronologically, and there can be a sense of downplay of the event or uncertainty, and certainly in that initial window to struggle to answer questions for all the control and patterns of harm reasons that we know exist. But one of the things that we can reinforce is that no matter what someone's perceived injury or their view of how serious, if they have had any form of non-fatal strangulation, is that they must be seen by a doctor, clinician, A&E, medical assessment, because injuries, medical complications can be hidden and not appear significant, but actually be some real concerning, damaging and life-threatening injuries underneath. Any questions before I move on? Wait to see if any hands pop up. Nope. Okay. Yeah. So domestic abuse in older people, and again, within, I know the audience I'm speaking to, a lot of this will be things that you know and realise and recognise already. We understand that there's been a lot of work done within the force by Tom Herbert previously around the adults at risk space because of this kind of systemic criminal justice invisibility or perception bias when it comes to older people being victims of domestic abuse, making sure that we factor in the fact that often this abuse could have been going on for the whole of that person's relationship, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years or more, and there's often dependency issues that can be kind of happening concurrently around long-term systemic alcohol use, drug dependency, mental health conditions, etc., that run alongside. There's also the generational attitudes to DA and around us making sure our officers know that the people that we are going to see and going to be having interactions with are potentially less likely to identify as what's happened as domestic abuse, and the stats say that are less statistically likely to leave that relationship because of how ingrained and interconnected their lives have become. And again, just some stats. These are from 2024. So 68% of victims who engage with support have not attempted to leave their abuser for that older generation, and 32% of victims over 60 are living with the perpetrator at the time of reporting, and 44% of victims over 60 experience domestic abuse by a wider family member. So there is a prevalence there, and it's made kind of challenging for all people involved because of our ability and knowledge to recognize it and to be able to educate people and inform their understanding, but also those generational attitudes, perceptions, biases that exist that make people maybe not feel like that they are victims of this behavior when they are. So it's a kind of a challenging area, but a lot of work has been done by Tom Herbert, kind of superintendent from our force, and linking in with the adults at risk partnerships and the safeguarding adults boards. I know, so you might have even had presentations from him before. So we're kind of working together to try and get the prevalence and understanding of that known and understood better across the organisation. So in terms of DHRs, so and I learned something around, I think 6 months or a year ago when I was at a meeting. We still colloquially refer to them as DHRs, but we're actually now domestic abuse related death reviews, or DARDAs. Which were DHRs, and the language is kind of still interchangeable. I hear at various meetings both terms be used. So essentially, this is where domestic abuse related death review happens, as again most of you will know, when a person aged 16 or over dies from violence, abuse or neglect from either close relations or household members. And it also includes suicide linked to domestic abuse, where abuse influenced the suicidal behaviour, or where DA could have been a wider consideration from it. So again, I'm not going to read all of that on the screen. People can kind of read it, but the Home Office commissioned a review of then DHRs published in 2020, looking at kind of a 12-month period, mainly about 2019-2020, but also some of the 2017-2018 cases, and they produced kind of a series of statements that were on screen. So again, this idea of genderedness, 80% of them were female victims. The fact that it was a lot of intimate partner, so 73% of perpetrators were current or former partners. So they kind of drew out some of those key themes. And again, nearly half of the cases back then included coercive control. And I think if they reran that now, that would be even a lot higher, probably closer, in my opinion, rather than fact. They're probably 75-80% of cases. So they drew out a lot of facts and kind of understanding of how DHRs kind of looked like and what the makeup was. And then the second tier of kind of points, we have what we call the Major Crime Statutory Review Team within our organisation, and part of their role, along with other things to do with all statutory reviews, is to ensure that there's a kind of conduit for learning across DHRs or DARDAs, and obviously Chris Windsor as head of the kind of DA, as DA lead, gets cited on the learning and supporting and how that's read out to the organisation. But the list I put in front of you here on the right with the bullet points is just to give you a flavour of some of the previous recommendations. These aren't all from one DHR or DARDA, but these are some of the different kind of recommendations or learning that has come out of it. So around disguised compliance needs to be more actively challenged. So that kind of not assuming compliance is real and that actually it could be disguised because of fear, because of control, because of circumstance. Bias awareness, which again we've already touched upon, kind of that, and that crosses age, gender, substance use, and we shouldn't be kind of be biased in our decision making because of either the presence or lack of presence of those factors. Joint working, which I know is often a feature that comes out of most kind of reviews of this nature, around joint working with probation and police to be strengthened. Non-fatal strangulation needs to be treated as a medical emergency, which I know we touched upon in the slide. Escalation must trigger some sort of disruption, and that kind of case continuity. So as I said, this isn't all from one case. This is just some learning kind of just pulled out from different ones that have happened over time. So yeah, important for us to know and understand what they are, and when they do come in, those processes are in place to ensure that learning is shared and the changes where we can are made to policies, procedures to make the system better based on that learning.